had a look again at function and field, where that comes up. And again, I'm probably going to get lost in the digression that preempts that. You know, one paradox and difficult point that often comes up in teaching Lacanian ideas at a basic level is that Lacan does not like a kind of genetic or developmental approach to psychology. And then, you know, there's a bit of a gasp because, you know, when you think about the importance of developmental psychology, which is something I think Lacan's pretty much going to reject completely almost, you know, that throws us into a bit of a puzzle. Like, what? How can you reject all of that? Don't we have the so-called psychosexual stages? You know, oral, anal, all of that stuff. And I mean, there's lots to be said about that. So I'll try not to get on too much of a digression, but one of the points then that comes up in function and field is that historicization and the historical dimension to the subject is absolutely crucial, is absolutely pivotal, even though the attempt to locate the subject on a developmental linear trajectory is not what Lacan wants to do. And there's multiple reasons why he wants to move away from that. Number one, the very notion of Freud's idea of the temporality of the unconscious is you know, the unconscious has no time, or the time of the unconscious is not a sequential, linear, developmental, progressive time that goes from the one corner to the next. So if that's true, then we have to take the whole developmental stages thing with a pinch of salt. Likewise, you could say that libido is never simply schooled from some undifferentiated, polymorphously perverse sort to a point when it reaches this kind of pinnacle of genital, typically, you know, heterosexual utopia of the genital drive. Yeah, maybe we see something like that, but like the very notion of drive as such, is going to resist that simple schematic schematization. So there already, you know, sexuality is not that easily domesticated, even though it may take on, you know, certain regular forms and so on and so forth. So there's a couple of reasons why a developmentalist schema is something that Lacan opposes. We could add more to that, but that's an important backdrop. And the reason I mention this is I always remember a very good Lacanian author and analyst called, I think his name's Leonardo Rodriguez, makes this distinction. He says Lacanians and Lacan doesn't go for a developmental notion of the subject, but they are interested in the history of the subject. And those two things are somewhat different. And of course, it used to plague me like, well, what exactly is the difference? So one of the ideas then, and I think there's two ideas that are quite importantly interconnected. It's interesting that in function and field, Lacan will talk about the historicization of the subject. And I kind of like that because it's not the same kind of vocabulary you'd use if you're thinking in developmental terms of stages, which of course also, you know, brings with it a kind of critical period, all of this stuff that is now commonplace. I mean, just incidentally, sorry, a digression again, is that why Lacan doesn't like this whole genetic thing, is he says, if you're taking a structuralist position on human subjectivity seriously, the human subject does not learn language in a developmental one word at a time way. It's not like a behavior schema whereby you would learn one word, then another word, then another word, and you build them up. Rather, you need the structure, you really need to have a series of grammatical notions, and then you speak. You don't start speaking properly, but you need a kind of basic sensibility of how signifiers work and how grammar works when you start speaking. And you don't learn language one grammatical rule at a time. So, you know, again, just another critique of the whole developmentalist thing. So we've got that on the one side. What then do we mean by historicization? And I started saying one of the reasons I like that historicization word is historicization is a word that implies the importance of symbolic activities. It implies a whole series of terms, whether we want to think about writing, recording, documenting, historicizing, all of these kinds of things. But then there's a an important caveat to how he talks about it. And I'm just going to pick out this quote. So we're around page 216 in the Bruce Fink 2006 complete edition in English. And I'm just going to read it a way I've tried to make sense of it. Lacan comments here that we need to distinguish between primary and secondary functions of historicization. Okay, so we've already said that historicization, or thinking the history of the subject, is important. And now we're getting to this puzzling distinction between what is primary and secondary functions of historicization. And just for a bit of a shameless plug, I'm reading from this commentary on function and field. So if we're trying to understand what does he mean by primary and secondary functions of historicization, we might be able to do this by referring to the idea of secondary revision. That is, to an awareness of what conscious or ego-led narrativization does to the experience of a dream. Okay, so we all know about secondary revision, and we know about the rearrangement of the dream's elements, the filling in of gaps, the selection of only certain components in the retelling of the dream. All of these are considerations, along with the general imposition of considerations of narrative intelligibility. All of these exercise a significant reworking of the material. So what I've argued previously is this is also true for primary historicization, which Lacan also refers to as primal historicization, referring even at one point to the constitutive subjectivity of primal historicization. So we can think of this as the original primal experience as it was lived by the subject and how it is historically reconstructed. But the point that I like about that is it's not the primal experience of living is never outside of the signifier, which sounds weird, because by the time one reflects on it, or by the time one tries to have one minimal temporal distance from the reflection of the thing that happened and how one speaks it, subjects it to meaning, subjects it to signifiers, it's already historicized. So I like that point. Like often we would make that assumption that a primal historicization is just the pure stuff of experience, but not for Lacan. The stuff of happening experience right here and now is already occurring within a field of signifiers, and the very minimal distance one has of it to speak of it, to say this is what's just happened to me, is already a form of historicization. So sorry for belaboring the point, but I love that. And one of the reasons I love that is because what it means then is there's never, well, I suppose we should be careful about this, but just, provisionally, there's never a non-symbolic dimension or a purely externality to symbolic existence in the Lacanian universe, certainly not for the neurotic subject. Okay, it's always around within a field of signifiers, even if one hasn't, as it were, actively engaged them yet. Hence, Lacan's comment, events are engendered in a primal historicization. History is already being made on the stage where it will be played out once it has been written down. So history is already being made on the stage where it will be played out once it's been written down, both in one's heart of hearts and outside. So that's a quote on 216 of Function and Field. Then my comment following that is to say documented history is always effectively secondary historicization. It is always what was said to have happened. History immediately plays out within a scene of interpretation, representation, and language, and within the intersubjective dimension that such a scene implies. So maybe just to reiterate that, and then let me get some comments from you guys, because there it starts to sound a bit smudgy again. The way I'm getting it is that primary historicization is implicit almost in the experiencing of the thing itself, in as much as it is minimally structured or utilized or mediated by speech, language, reflection. But we also have the secondary historicization of how one subsequently refers back to how things were, as it were, symbolically mediated and experienced. So I don't know if that's helping, but that's my take on historicization. And Lacan goes on to give some kind of tricky examples of all of that. But presumably part of what the purpose of analysis is also to be able to offer some means of a secondary historicization of a primary historicization, if you could put it in those terms.